It says, yeah,
There we go. All right, so that should get rid of the practice webinar on the top.
Yep.
And all right, and people will slowly come into the room right now. Let's see. Give it a couple more seconds for people to load in. Gil, I'm gonna stop your sharing for a second, okay?
yeah, okay, sure. Now you'll tell me when to start it again?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right, I'll probably fumble around with it a bit before
No worries.
restart.
All right, welcome everyone. We'll take another maybe minute or two for everyone to trickle in. Tonight's presentation is going to be about dining out in Bloomingdale, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. So yeah, we typically just wait a couple minutes for people to come in.
Mhm. All right.
We'll get started around 6:33. I'll say 6:34.
Okay.
For those of you who just joined in, welcome. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Tonight's presentation is going to be about Bloomingdale dining out. Basically, we'll talk a little bit more about the presentation in a bit.
Of course, this is historical dining out. We're not gonna mention many places, if any, that are still around.
Um, yeah, okay. So we'll get started now. So
All
welcome
right.
everyone. This is welcome to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group History Talk. Tonight's talk will be about Bloomingdale dining out across 3 centuries. Our speaker tonight is going to be Gil Tauber. The way the presentations work is that we'll have a 45 to 50-minute presentation. Any questions you have, you can put them into the chat function and we'll answer them towards the end of the presentation. Abigail Jack, my coworker here, is going to be answering your questions at the end of the presentation. So again, feel free to ask your questions, and then we'll also let people ask themselves if they don't want to put it in the chat. You can raise your hands at the end. But if you have any other urgent questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them into the chat. Gil, take it away.
Oh, okay, just like that. All right, I do want to say that what the presentation that we're giving this evening uh, is a reworking of a presentation that was originally done a couple of years ago at the first iteration of Bloomingdale Bites, which was a tasting event that was sponsored by the Columbus Amsterdam bid in cooperation with primarily the West 104th Street Block Association. And at that time, a somewhat longer version of this presentation was given in segments. Um, the material in this presentation was, was based on research by a few members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, um, including myself, but also notably Pam Tice, uh, Jim Mackin, and Rob Garber contributed very importantly to this. So let us begin. All right. Um, and
You want to
okay, we
start
start
screen?
with a screen sharing now. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Let's see how this works. Um, all right. How's that showing up? Huh? Okay. Um, Now, for those of you who don't know, the name Bloomingdale goes back to at least the 1680s, when it was a name for the entire West Side from 42nd Street up to 129th Street. It has nothing to do with the department store, which didn't come along until 200 years later. In 1688, the English, who had only recently seized the colony from the Dutch, gave out nearly all of the Bloomingdale area in a series of land grants, most of it to a consortium of well-connected merchants and government officials. And this map you see here, the Hudson River is at the top.
Gil,
And
one thing I would suggest is making it full size, maybe?
let's see, making it full size. How do I do that?
You should be able to
The
press the slideshow button at the top.
The slideshow button at the top,
one of the tabs there.
layout, annotate, remote control, show webinar. Um,
Or at the bottom of the PowerPoint, there should be a little icon to the right. That one. The far right.
oh,
That
you're
one.
seeing that one?
Yep.
Aha. Wonderful. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I'll let you go ahead again.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So what you see here is a map kind of laid on its side. The Hudson River is at the top. And notice over here, this little notch at 96th Street. So the British gave out these land grants in in about 1667, and 20 years later, the largest of these grants, which extended from 87th to 107th Street, was bought by a Dutch farmer named Tunis Ides, and he built his house on the north side of this little cove here, the cove that was later known as Stryker's Bay. Now, that cove was important to Tunis Ides because there were no roads up here at the time. In order to sell his crops, he had to bring them down to the city by boat. And the city at that time meant the area roughly south of today's Fulton Street. Now, in addition to there being no roads up here, there were obviously no restaurants. In fact, nothing that we would recognize as a restaurant existed in America until nearly the end of the colonial period. What New York did have, and where Tunis Ides could get a meal if he needed to, were taverns. Let's see, next. There we are. Okay. Now, the main business of a tavern was selling alcohol, a product much in demand in a port city, but as a center of commerce frequented by merchants and other travelers, the city also needed places for visitors to stay. Therefore, in exchange for a license to sell alcohol, tavern keepers were not simply allowed, but often required to provide sleeping accommodations and meals for travelers. Tavern accommodations varied greatly in quality. A bed might be as simple as a pile of straw by the fireplace. Meals were communal, generally a hot meal at midday and a cold supper in the evening. Taverns were male bastions in those days, with heavy eating, drinking, gambling, and pastimes such as bear baiting and cockfights. On the other hand, the better taverns could also be used for courtrooms, auctions, and government meetings. And it was from such establishments that restaurants as well as hotels eventually developed. Now, in addition to taverns in town, there were taverns in some outlying locations, such as at ferry landings. Around 1700, roads were built up the island, and a few taverns were established at strategic locations along these roads. By far the most important of these outlying establishments was slightly outside Bloomingdale in what is now Central Park. This was the Black Horse or McGowan's Tavern on the Eastern Post Road near today's 104th Street. That was at a narrow point on the road in those hills. The tavern was built around 1740 by Jacob Dykeman, who sold it to some in-laws named McGowan, who ran it for the next half century, and it was quite a busy place. During a yellow fever epidemic in 1752, the Colonial Assembly held its meetings here after evacuating the city. And during the American Revolution, it was heavily fortified by the British, and then it was fortified again by the Americans during the War of 1812. And in fact, part of those fortifications can still be seen in Central Park. The tavern site was later a convent, a military hospital during the Civil War, a sculpture gallery, and again, a restaurant that lasted actually until 1915. Here we have a view of McGowan's Pass in 1816 after this was showing the fortifications during the War of 1812, which, as I said, some of them are still there. And then this is the restaurant that was built on the site, and that lasted until into the early 20th century. Now, Bloomingdale itself, which is basically the area between Central Park and the Hudson River, was a rural backwater well into the 18th century. And based on a 1703 census, the entire district may have had fewer than 100 people. But in 1708, the area became a lot less isolated with the building of the Bloomingdale Road, the ancestor of today's Upper Broadway. The road opened up the area to more settlement. And in particular, Bloomingdale's elevated location and river views attracted some of New York's wealthiest citizens to build country houses here. What may have been the earliest tavern on the Bloomingdale Road, what do we got here? This is a menu from that 1915 restaurant that I showed you before. Let's move on. What may have been the earliest tavern on the Bloomingdale Road was the Oakley Tavern near 71st Street. A contemporary newspaper ad described it as a large two-story house with 12 rooms, one a handsome ballroom, a good cellar, dairy, kitchen, barn, and other outhouses. In 1797, the tavern's proprietor was a Mr. Palmer, who called it the Old Bloomingdale Inn and Tea Garden, perhaps appealing to women who were out for an afternoon's carriage ride. However, in November, another ad for the same place described it as a beefsteak and oyster house. Now, here is another ad. This is from, 1797. And he's advertising to gentlemen on shooting parties, traveling or riding out, and describes his offerings of food and drink. In May 1798, the business had evidently changed hands again. Mr. Daniel Mayer advertised that he would be running the Bloomingdale Inn and Tea Garden, occupied lately by Mr. Palmer, he says, and that he would be providing, quote, a neat carriage and a good pair of horses, unquote, bring his guests up to his establishment. The carriage would leave Water Street, that's way downtown, near Peck Slip at 3 in the afternoon and return at 7 in the evening. By 1808, the inn was also booking banquets. In that year, it hosted a group of Masons who marched from the inn to St. Michael's Church at 99th Street, still on that same site, and back to the inn for dinner to celebrate the festival of St. John the Baptist. By about 1806, distinct villages were forming along the Bloomingdale Road. One, called Harsonville, was centered around 71st Street, an area that included Daniel Mayer's Bloomingdale Inn. Another, called Manhattanville, was laid out around 125th Street. And yet another, called Bloomingdale Village, grew up in the vicinity of 100th Street. In the course of the early 19th century, some of Bloomingdale's older houses were turned into establishments that styled themselves as hotels. It was a word only recently borrowed from French and denoted somewhat fancier accommodations than an inn or a tavern. In Bloomingdale, these establishments were primarily destinations for a day or a weekend excursion on the scenic Bloomingdale Road. And that, if we can believe the artist, is what it looked like back in those days. And you can see the river on the left there. Okay. The most interesting of these establishments was the Strikers Bay Hotel. In 1764, a man named Garrett Stryker acquired Tunis Ide's old homestead overlooking the cove at the foot of 96th Street. And he built a large new house on the site. In 1831, that house became a hotel, and people came to it for hikes, shooting parties, boating, and dancing. It was frequented by prominent poets and writers, including Edgar Allan Poe. One day in 1837, a couple of hotel guests out for a walk came upon a farmer, probably a tenant on the property, about to cut down a magnificent old tree. They begged him to save it. The farmer agreed to preserve the tree for $10, which was a lot of money in those days, and even signed a contract to that effect. One of the guests, the newspaper editor George Pope Morris, wrote a poem about it. Woodman, spare that tree. That poem was memorized by generations of school children and was also a popular song. There's the Strikers Bay Hotel in that was in the 1850s. And here is the sheet music for Woodman, spare that tree. The poem was memorized by generations of school children. And when the Strikers Bay Hotel burned in 1860, the tree was still standing. And I should mention, Morris, by the way, was what used to be called a man of parts. In addition to being a publisher, literary critic, poet, playwright, and librettist, he was a general in the New York State Militia. Not far from Strikers Bay was the former house of Humphrey Jones. Built before 1752, it stood between 101st and 102nd Street, slightly west of today's West End Avenue. This may have been the old inn at Bloomingdale, which in 1807 ran an ad for a fox hunt. And you can see this. It says, a fine wild fox taken within a fortnight is now in possession of the subscriber at Bloomingdale, where gentlemen sportsmen are invited to meet on Monday next, January 12th, 1807, when the fox, accompanied with an excellent pack of hounds, will be started at such time and place as the sportsman may fix upon. Not a happy day for the fox, I'm sure. 7 years later, in 1815, this same establishment was run by Thomas Rogers, who wrote, "He fancies his liquors and accommodations will give general satisfaction to the gentlemen who favor him with their company." By 1844, the building had become the Abbey Hotel and was a popular spot for another decade or so before finally closing in 1857. About a quarter mile north was another grand house that became a destination hotel. It was called Woodlawn. And apart from the fine river views, it was famous as the site of an important engagement in the American Revolution. In September 1776, George Washington sent out a scouting party that clashed with British troops in the field around this house. This skirmish triggered the larger engagement that came to be known as the Battle of Harlem Heights. It's considered the first American victory of the Revolutionary War, though significant more for boosting morale than for any strategic advantage. In the early 19th century, Woodlawn and its surrounding 16 acres were the country estate of William and Sarah Hayward. A distinguished visitor there was the British author Frances Trollope. She wrote a glowing description of Woodlawn and of her gracious hosts in her 1831 book, Domestic Manners of the Americans. It was a marked contrast to the rest of her book, which generally described Americans as uncouth, unsanitary, arrogant, and thin-skinned, which is probably why the book became a runaway bestseller in England. In 1847, the widowed Sarah Hayward sold Woodlawn to Dr. William B. Moffat. He'd made a fortune selling a patent medicine called Moffat's Life Pills and Phoenix Bitters, a remedy for an improbably long list of ailments. Moffat lived at Woodlawn briefly, but then he too leased it out as a hotel. It was a popular destination in its time, but was in business for little more than a dozen years. Dr. Moffat's miraculous pills notwithstanding, he was only 44 when he died in 1862. The building was demolished in 1897, and its site is now the block between 106th and 107th Street from West End Avenue to Riverside Drive. In the 1840s and 50s, there were a series of major infrastructure projects that disrupted the genteel rural atmosphere of Bloomingdale. The first, completed in 1842, was the building of the Croton Aqueduct to bring water into New York City from upstate. It included a massive stone structure, 50 feet high, bridging the valley between 101st and 95th Street near Columbus Avenue. The second project, completed in 1849, was the construction of the Hudson River Railroad. And the third, beginning in the late 1850s, was the construction of Central Park. Each of these involved thousands of workers, mostly Irish and German immigrants, a good many of whom settled in the area. In the 1850s, the presence of a substantial German population encouraged the establishment of the Lion Lager Beer Brewery. For many years, it was the area's largest employer, with a workforce eventually numbering over 2,000. And here you see its buildings around the intersection of 108th Street and Columbus Avenue. It took up parts of 4 city blocks. There was actually a bridge over Columbus Avenue, and you can see faintly these 2 lines, which connected the main brewery building to a 2-acre beer garden and catering hall called the Lion Palace. Yeah, here we are. In 1879, when the 9th Avenue L was built along Columbus Avenue, the bridge had to be taken down. There we are. My cursor seems to wander off by itself. Sorry about that. Although the beer garden continued for several more years before being sold to developers. In the meantime, the brewery established a new Lion Palace at Broadway and 110th Street, which we'll say more about a little later. Now, one of the grandest houses in Bloomingdale was built in 1764 by Charles Ward Apthorpe, a British merchant and colonial official who, despite being a loyalist, managed to hang on to his property after the American Revolution. When he died in 1797, the mansion and surrounding grounds were bought by another wealthy Englishman named William Jauncey. And you may remember we had a presentation a few months ago about Jauncey Lane. The mansion, known as Elmwood or Elm Park, stood in the block now bounded by 91st and 92nd between Amsterdam and Columbus. And by the 1850s, it had been leased as a hotel and pleasure ground, geared to accommodating mass events, often of an ethnic character. Let me see. In 1853, the New York Times reported a celebration there of the birthday of the Marquis de Lafayette. This was when New York had a large French immigrant population. In 1855, it was reported that 30,000 people assembled at Elm Park for the picnic of the Zengverein, a German social organization. Some of these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt. In 1861, during the Civil War, a regiment of 800 New York volunteers encamped on the Elm Park grounds before heading off to battle. In 1870, it was the site of a riot when Catholic Irish laborers protested a gathering of Orangemen, leaving 3 people dead and 6 mortally wounded. In 1881, New York's Italian population had grown to the point where Elm Park hosted, according to the New York Times, 24,000 people celebrating the birthday of Giuseppe Mazzini. Now, clearly the old mansion got a lot of hard use. And this is what it looked like before it was finally torn down in 1891 to make way for the opening of 91st Street. Now, at the end of the Civil War, the Upper West Side was still mostly open country. Streets had been mapped through the area, but it was clear that many places were so steep or rocky that it was not practical to build streets. In 1865, a revised street plan was adopted for the Upper West Side. It included the creation of Riverside Park, Riverside Drive, and Morningside Park. And in addition, it called for the replacement of the old Bloomingdale Road with the wide boulevard that we now know as Broadway. Now, this map from 1867 shows both the Bloomingdale Road, which is this over here, and the path of the proposed boulevard, which opened the following year. Probably the first building to open on the new boulevard was a 3-story wooden structure erected in 1871 by a grocer named Henry Grimm, who had his store on the ground floor and apartments on the 2 floors above. Unfortunately, Grimm lost it to foreclosure 5 years later. The ground floor became a saloon, which it remained for nearly half a century. In 1894, it was bought by the brewer Peter Dolger. In those days, to assure a market for their own product, brewers would buy up saloons and lease them to tenant saloon keepers. By the way, Dolger's own mansion was nearby at 280 Riverside Drive. With the advent of Prohibition in 1920, of course, the former saloon became a millinery shop and later a cigar store. The 3rd floor was covered with billboards. In the 1960s, there was another kind of restaurant, a tea room on the 2nd floor, while the 3rd floor was a TV rehearsal studio and the headquarters of the Living Theater, a well-known avant-garde theater company of that era. By 1990, the old wooden building was badly in need of renovation. Its structure was reinforced with steel and its clapboard replaced by vinyl siding. The ground floor became the Metro Diner, which, mirabile dictu, is still there. Okay, now, here we see a real estate map from 1891. Notwithstanding the boulevard and the new parks, there was very little development in Bloomingdale until the mid-1880s. That had to await the extension of water and sewer lines, the cutting through of new streets, and the opening of the 9th Avenue elevated on Columbus Avenue. But by the end of that decade, there were rows of tenements and small apartment buildings along Amsterdam Avenue. You can see that over here. Amsterdam and Columbus Avenues, but Most of the land along Broadway and the blocks west of it was still vacant. This is 1891. Only in the 1890s did West End Avenue, Riverside Drive, and the side streets west of Broadway begin to fill up with rows of brownstones and other single-family houses for the affluent. One of the notable social phenomena of the 1890s was the bicycle craze. Bicycling was a sporting activity socially acceptable for both men and women, which probably helped to make it wildly popular, especially among young people. Bloomingdale's parks and its long paved avenues, especially the recently opened Riverside Drive, were thronged with cyclists. In the spring of 1896, traffic counters tallied more than 14,000 bicyclists over a 16-hour period. A frequent destination for cyclists was the Claremont Inn, just north of Grant's Tomb. The Claremont was another of Bloomingdale's grand old mansions. Built in 1804 and once occupied by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the ex-king of Spain. It was converted to a roadhouse about 1840. In the 1870s, the city acquired the property as part of Riverside Park and leased the building out as a restaurant. For decades, people traveling on horseback or in carriages and later by bicycle or automobile would stop to dine and enjoy the panoramic view of the Hudson. This gives you an idea of what the place looked like in its glory days. It was an upscale establishment. In 1907, when the average weekly wage in America was about $10, a slice of Montreal melon cost 75 cents and a planked steak cost $5. This was the Gilded Age. Its guests included socialites, military heroes, and at least 2 American presidents. Not surprisingly, the Claremont languished during Prohibition. In the 1930s, under Mayor LaGuardia, the Claremont Inn was revived with drinks, dining, and dancing, but with more moderate prices. In the late 1940s, Robert Moses deemed the old building too far gone to repair and ordered it torn down. It was already under demolition when a fire in March 1951 completed its destruction. The site is now occupied by a playground. So there are some of us still around who can remember that building. Now, if you look again at that 1867 map, you'll see some rows of very small buildings along 110th Street. These frame houses had been built several years earlier by a family named Dixon, who rented them mainly to German and Irish immigrants, at least initially. In the early 1890s, the western end of the block, right there, became the site of the Lion Palace, owned, as I'd mentioned, by the Lion Brewery, which developed into a popular entertainment resort, as those places were called. The palace had a summer roof garden, and performers were regularly covered in newspaper entertainment listings. After Columbia University moved to Morningside Heights in 1896, it became a popular spot for the college's students. Perhaps because of the Lion's popularity, other such resorts began to develop along West 110th Street, some not so wholesome, creating a rather disreputable entertainment district that was often referred to as Little Coney Island. Little Coney Island was not a compliment. A number of the houses in Dixon's Row, and here's a photo of it, became saloons, dance halls, or outright brothels. To nearby property owners, they were a blight on the neighborhood. They also attracted the ire of the Anti-Saloon League and local clergymen. The police had been inclined to turn a blind eye on the goings-on in Little Coney Island, for reasons you can imagine. But under enormous pressure from property owners and reform groups, they conducted a series of raids that closed down the offending establishments by 1901. The Lion Palace, less tainted than its neighbors, continued in business until it was shut down by Prohibition about 1920 and replaced by a movie theater called the Nemo, which also some of us can remember. And there was later a D'Agostino's, and now it's the site of the building housing the H Mart Korean supermarket. By the 1890s, nearly all of Columbus Avenue had been built up with 5-story tenements with retail spaces on the ground floor. A good part of that retail space was occupied by small restaurants and bars, especially near the elevated station, such as the one at 104th. This was essentially a working class neighborhood. There was a lot of turnover in local businesses, and we don't know much about them. But one restaurant under the elevated prospered and survived well into the 20th century. This was Gosler Brothers, which occupied the ground floors of 5 adjacent buildings at the northwest corner of 104th Street. This ad from 1919 showed that space in 2 of the buildings was devoted to a men's grill, a raw bar, and lunch counter, all exclusively for gentlemen. The space in the 3 other buildings included a family dining room and additional rooms that appear to have served as event spaces, banquet rooms. And if you go today to Columbus Avenue and 104th Street, those buildings are still there. Only one of the ground floor spaces, of the 5 ground floor spaces, is occupied by a food service establishment, I believe a Chinese takeout establishment. Now, the first 2 decades of the 20th century were the golden age of the restaurant business on the Upper West Side. And the reason for that can be summed up in a brief phrase: the IRT subway. The opening of the subway in 1904 spurred a huge wave of development, especially in the blocks west of Broadway. Nearly all the remaining vacant lots were filled up, and in some places, such as along West End Avenue, rows of 20-year-old brownstones were torn down to make way for 12 and 13-story apartment houses. There was a huge increase in population, and along Broadway, the numerous vacant sites were snapped up for construction not only of apartment houses, but also hotels and commercial buildings. 96th Street was the subway system's key junction, where the line from Lower Manhattan split into branches, one serving Upper Manhattan and the other crossing into the Bronx. This made the stretch of Broadway from about 90th to 110th Streets a prime location for theaters and related businesses. By 1920, there were more than a dozen vaudeville and movie theaters, as well as dance halls, pool rooms, bowling alleys, and of course, restaurants. The full-service restaurants of this era fell into 2 main types: freestanding establishments and those located in hotels. The freestanding restaurant buildings were almost all 2 stories high, with bars, public and private dining rooms, and live musicians to accompany dining and dancing. Among the better-known restaurants of this type were the Colonial Restaurant at 108th and Broadway, Keneally's at 111th and Broadway, the Carlton Terrace at 100th and Broadway, and a place called Unter den Linden at 97th and Broadway. Unter den Linden was named after a fashionable boulevard in Berlin. In addition to the building, Unter den Linden had about an acre of outdoor space for its beer garden. And the little inset map in the upper right-hand corner shows the Unter den Linden building, and then all of this vacant space that was the beer garden. Beer gardens and other German-style eating establishments became very common in New York in the late 19th century, when immigrants from German-speaking countries made German the city's second language, comparable to Spanish today. German and Austrian influence on dining can also be seen in this photo of Broadway and 104th Street, showing the old Vienna and new Vienna restaurants. So Teutonic food was among the first ethnic cuisines adopted by Americans, eventually stretching from hot dogs to coffee cake to strudels and potato salad. In these early 20th century restaurants, Wiener Schnitzel and Apfelstrudel were no doubt on the menu. However, with the advent of the First World War, beer gardens and other German-style establishments fell out of favor. Unter den Linden's beer garden was sold off in 1919. Excuse me. Got to wet that whistle. So Unter den Linden's beer garden was sold off in 1919, and two very large apartment buildings were built on the site. However, the restaurant building remained. It's the only structure of this type surviving in Bloomingdale, and the ground floor still houses the restaurant today. Now, the other type of establishment in that golden age were hotel dining rooms. Today, we think of hotels as places, primarily as places for short-term stays. But a century ago, many people, at least those who could afford it, lived in hotels for months or years at a time. Also, some builders found it more profitable to build a hotel than an apartment house, since hotels were classified as commercial buildings and subject to less strict building regulations. Some of the best-known buildings in our area were originally built as hotels, or as they were slyly called, apartment hotels, including the Master Apartments, the Paris, the Cliff Dwellers, and the Broadmoor. Now, legally, in order to qualify as a hotel, the suites or rooms could not have cooking facilities. Guests were expected either to order room service from the hotel kitchen or to take their meals in the hotel restaurant. Thus, the quality of a hotel restaurant was an important selling point, and hotel restaurants were often favored dining destinations. Among the better-known hotel restaurants of that era was the Carlton Terrace Hotel, later known as the Whitehall. In addition to the dining room shown in the slide, it had a rooftop restaurant that offered dining and dancing. Other hotel restaurants included that of the Marseille at 103rd Street, the Clendenning at Amsterdam and 103rd, and the St. George at 102nd Street. Another type of restaurant that appeared in the early 20th century was the tea room. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a time when a respectable woman could not appear in a restaurant alone, even with a female friend. As late as 1907, a woman sued the Hoffman House Hotel for refusing to seat a friend and herself. She lost the suit, but department stores in particular began to see the value of places where women could dine out comfortably without male escorts. And then this policy was adopted by some restaurant chains. Women diners were at the heart of the success of the Schrafft's restaurant chain. It started out as a candy company, but began introducing light lunches in its candy stores in 1909. And soon it was operating full-fledged restaurants. Of course, it served men as well, but it was known for providing a comfortable dining environment for women and families. By the late 1930s, it had about 40 locations in the New York area. One of these was on the east side of Broadway, just north of 107th Street, in the space that was most recently occupied by the Garden of Eden supermarket. In the early 1900s, a number of companies opened restaurants in downtown business districts, mainly to provide quick, moderately priced meals to office workers on their lunch hours. They did not serve alcohol, which was an important factor to the employees of these people. And they emphasized cleanliness, often with white tiled walls and shiny metal fixtures. Initially, they offered table service as well as lunch counters. A later wrinkle was the introduction of cafeteria service using tray lines. In the techniques they developed, these downtown restaurants were the ancestors of nearly all of today's fast food restaurants, coffee shops, luncheonettes, and cafeterias. Some of these restaurants grew into regional chains, including Childs, Waldorf Cafeterias, Bickford's, Rikers, and Horn and Hardart. And while they initially focused on lunch service, some of them found it worthwhile to stay open 24 hours. A few of these chains had outposts in Bloomingdale. In 1947, the Rikers chain leased the corner store in the Regent Hotel building at Broadway and 104th. The company hired a noted ceramic artist, Max Sivak, to design a swirling abstract mosaic for a corner structural column. The coffee shop closed in the 1960s and the mosaic was hidden by a later renovation, but it was uncovered and restored a few years ago when the space was taken over by a Ben & Jerry's, and it is still there, happily. Of the various low-priced restaurants catering to working people, the ones best remembered by New York old-timers are the Horn and Hardart Automats. In these quirky establishments, a variety of food items, baked beans, apple pie, Salisbury steak, were displayed behind little glass windows that popped open when you inserted the proper number of nickels in a slot. Coffee was likewise dispensed from a spout at the insertion of a nickel. The company kept the price of coffee at 5 cents until 1950, when it reluctantly raised it to a dime. Joseph Horn and Frank Hardart opened the first automat in Philadelphia in 1902. The first one in the New York area was not opened until 1912, but the automats achieved their greatest success here, expanding to more than 50 outlets. Nationally, the automat was closely identified with New York, thanks to scenes in several Hollywood movies and the company's sponsorship of a national radio show, the Horn and Hardart Children's Hour. Our neighborhood can boast the last intact automat building in Manhattan, the 3-story Art Deco structure at the southeast corner of Broadway and 104th. It opened in 1930, and it's a designated New York City landmark. The automat here closed in 1954, and its space was later used as a supermarket and for various other purposes. In 2007, it was designated a New York City landmark. Its exterior was restored a few years ago after it became a CityMD urgent care center. This, by the way, is a slide of that automat building in the 1970s, where the central space, where you now have the entrance to the CityMD, was a Foodorama supermarket, and there was a luncheonette with open to the street service counter at the corner. Okay. Now, we brought us up to the mid-20th centuries, and that's as far as we can practically go. But looking to what happened in the 20th century, these fortune cookies are symbolic of a lot of subsequent developments. We don't know when the first Chinese restaurant appeared in Bloomingdale, but by the 1930s, nearly every New York neighborhood seemed to have at least one or two. The earliest Chinese restaurants featured chow mein and chop suey. The Chinese origins of these dishes are obscure, in fact, questionable. It's often claimed that they were actually invented in America by Chinese immigrant chefs. In any event, they are inexpensive, filling, and can be enjoyed by people unskilled in the use of chopsticks. Beginning in the 1960s, after the U.S. changed laws limiting Asian immigration, we began to see Chinese restaurants with more authentic and varied cuisine. Among the best known in this area was the Moon Palace at Broadway and 111th, a favorite of Columbia University students and memorialized in the title of a novel by Paul Auster. Another favorite was the Great Shanghai at 98th and Broadway, since occupied by a succession of Chinese restaurants. In the present century, Bloomingdale gained a wealth of restaurants offering many ethnic cuisines, including Italian, French, Jewish, Thai, Vietnamese, Ethiopian, and Japanese. Some of these did not survive the pandemic. Others were done in by rising rents. But Bloomingdale still offers an amazing variety of dining experiences waiting for you to try. And if you'd like to find out more about them, there is a website run by the Columbus Amsterdam BID called www.bloomingdalerestaurants.nyc. And if you go to that website, you will see capsule information, photos, menus, etc., about 150 restaurants, generally between 96th and 110th streets. Now let's see. Michael,
Yep.
do you have a couple of additional announcements to make?
Yes.
We save that till after the Q&A.
No, I'll make them now, just before we do the Q&A. The thing I wanted
Should I stop the screen sharing?
yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay, there we go. Okay.
For everyone who joined in, thank you for staying through to the end. I wanted to mention that Gil mentioned that this was a presentation that was given at the last Bloomingdale, or the first Bloomingdale Bites that we had with the West 104th Street Block Association, the West 102nd, 103rd. And I wanted to make sure that for those interested in the presentation and joining the next Bloomingdale Bites, I am putting the link in the chat now. So this is just like a RSVP to get a sense of how many people are coming. But please sign up, and you'll also be able to get more information about what restaurants are finalized. And basically what Bloomingdale Bites is a small food tasting from different restaurants in the neighborhood. So if there are restaurants you haven't been able to try out, this is a smaller price than buying a whole meal, but you'll be able to try out different restaurants throughout the neighborhood and get a sense of something new that you haven't tried. But for now,
So that's October 9th from 6 to 9 p.m.
correct. And that's at the Hostel International location on 103rd Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Any information that you guys might want to find, you can find it on our website, columbusamsterdambid.org. And again, this presentation has been recorded. And tomorrow morning, you'll be able to find the recording at the upperwestsidehistory.org website. Yep.
Yeah, referring to the West 104th Street Block Association.
Yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, in addition to being one of the sponsors of that Bloomingdale Bites event, you may know that the West 104th Street Block Association has an annual block fair, yard sale, which is going to be this Saturday on 104th Street between West End and Riverside Drive. From, I believe it runs from 10 a.m. to
5 p.m.
10 to 5, something like that. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And then, so for anyone who has any questions for the presentation, I'll let Abby moderate from here on, but feel free to raise your hands or place them into the chat.
Okay. Am I on the screen?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, there I am. Yeah.
Yes, you got it.
All right.
Free to send in any questions you may have.
All right. But it looks like I've so thoroughly overwhelmed you with this information that you have no questions.
Oh, we've got a question from Ken in the chat. He asked, do you have any info on the Butler Terrace?
The Butler Terrace. Well, I remember it well. I went to this is a restaurant that was on the roof of Butler Hall of Columbia University at 119th Street, I believe. You may know better than I. Is it, Abby, is it still there?
I have not heard of this at all. This is new information for me. For context, I just graduated from Barnard this past May. So, wow, I've heard of people going up to the top of Butler, but no, haven't heard of a formal or semi-formal
Yeah, there
restaurant up
was a,
there.
yeah, that restaurant was a favorite place in my college days. Yeah, which were some time ago. Yeah. Okay. Anything else there?
I'd also like to remind people, if you want to ask a question in like by voice, or like feel free to raise your hand and then we'll give you the opportunity to unmute yourself.
Yes, we have a question in the Q&A. So
Uh-huh.
an anonymous attendee asked, can we talk more about the beer garden?
Can we talk more about the beer garden? Well, uh, are we speaking of the beer garden? I mentioned two beer gardens. One was the Lion Palace Beer Garden at uh, Columbus Avenue and 108th Street, and
Yes, the one at 108th Street.
the other was the Unter den Linden Beer Garden. The one at 108th Street, I can tell you this about it. It's very interesting that, you know, this you got to imagine this was a the center of a German speaking enclave. And in I can't remember the date, but it was in the late 19th century. You know, there were a lot of German workers there, and a good many of them were from southern Germany and were Catholic. And the available Catholic churches were basically Irish, you know, and at a certain point, the archdiocese assigned a German-speaking priest to serve the German, to start a new parish to serve the German-speaking community. I don't recall the man's name, but you know, he needed to hold mass. And so the initial masses of this new parish were held in the building of the beer hall at the southeast corner of 108th and Columbus Avenue. And these formed the, you know, the core of the congregation that built what is now, oh gosh, it's the church on Ascension Church, I believe it is, on 107th between Broadway and Amsterdam.
Yeah, that's the essential.
Mm-hmm.
See.
All right. It's good to hear those were his father's people. That's very, very sweet.
Yes, that's right.
A
Yeah.
great tie to the
Uh,
personal history. We have another question from Anne in the chat. You mentioned a very early census. Can you provide more information about it?
oh, well, that's, I did a lot of digging into that. The purpose of the early colonial censuses was really to see how many men were available for military service. And so these censuses focused on men between the ages of 16 and 60, which was the kind of traditional age range for militia. I wrote a paper about this, which I posted as a blog on the website. It's kind of hard. you know, it's kind of hard to take the numbers without a little grain of salt. But, you know, there are several different ways that you can kind of estimate the population. One is by looking at maps which show existing buildings. Um, and the other is, you know, censuses of this kind. There are various lists, and there is a I think if you go on the blog, you'll find a paper that I wrote on the I think it's the title is something like 1703 census. Okay.
Yeah, I think we have one more question from Ken. He asked if there's any stories to tell about V&T, the Italian restaurant there at 111th in Amsterdam. And
Well,
we have a
I know that both of them are pretty venerable. Um, I went to them, uh, you know, when I was in college, which is like 70 years ago, and they were, you know, they were good places. You know, yeah. There is a story to the Hungarian pastry shop. I don't know it. Is Jim Mackin on this someplace?
He earlier, I think he had to, oh, he's still here. Let's see if he wants to say something about it.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And as somebody as somebody who has been one of the a very long time customer of the Hungarian pastry shop, could you fill us in
Indeed,
on
I'm
that?
there just about every morning from 7:30 writing my next book. But in my first book about notable New Yorkers on Manhattan's Upper West Side, there's a little bit of a sidebar that gives a summary history of it. I won't do it justice because it's got a fair number of detail, but it's part of one of the many mysteries of the Upper West Side, which is why the heck is it Hungarian when in fact the owners are Greek. It's a Greek family. And now the son Philip, of course, continues in the family tradition and whatnot. So I honestly don't know. And I do know they're kind of friends of the fellows that run V&T Pizza or V&T, you know, just a few doors down. And boy, there have been so many famous, even presidential politicians that stopped off there, like Bill Clinton and I think the Bushes. And in its day, you had to go to V&T to get votes. So
How far back does Hungarian pastry shop go? Does it go back to the 1940s or 50s?
no, I'm remembering mid-50s, but again, I'd have to refer to my own book even to refresh my recollection on that. So, but but I can dodge the question a little bit by going back to the Lion Brewery. Another mystery in the neighborhood I always thought was, gee, was there any connection between Lion Brewery and Lion, the mascot of Columbia? And, you know, Columbia having, when it was called King's College, of course, obviously had English history to it. And, you know, the lion is kind of the emblematic figure of Mother England. So I thought, gee, maybe there's a connection there, but I don't think so. And again, Gil, you and I know a little bit about the lion from Columbia that supposedly became the lion of MGM fame. And I apologize for all these tangents going off in different directions, but
Well, the Lion Brewery must, you know, must have some antecedents in Bavaria. You know, Löwenbräu is Lion Brew.
I suspect you're right. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think they had an earlier location downtown before they moved up to like 108th Street. And
Oh, yeah.
as you indicated, the largest employer in our neighborhood over a very, very long history. It's amazing the brewery history in New York City with the Dolges that were in our neighborhood. And I think Earhart also was in our neighborhood. I'm forgetting now. And of course, the Lion Brewery. we we get frustrated as historians not being able to pull together a comprehensive history of the Lion Brewery. So we'll have to look at that in the upcoming years, see if we could somehow do that. I also, Gil, help me with this too. I thought the outdoor beer garden from the Lion Brewery on the east side of Columbus Avenue between 107th and 108th Street became a park that was frequented by a lot of fraternal organizations and politicians. Am I getting that confused with another nearby park?
Well, there were several parks, so-called parks, uh, including the Elm Park that I spoke about at 91st Street. A lot of their business was hosting gatherings of all those associations that Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about. Americans were prone to join organizations, and I think German immigrants were too. There were all these music choral societies and Sängervereins and Turnvereins and a lot of social life was lived within these organizations who were constantly having meetings and gatherings and whatever, and a big business of these beer gardens was hosting these events.
Yeah. And another thing that quickly comes to mind, again, I apologize for being all over the lot here, but that restaurant on 104th Street, the northwest corner of Columbus, we had a fella.
Oh, the Gosler Brothers. Yeah.
We had a fella on one of our monthly walks who lived in the building, and indeed gave me at least an open invitation, and I never took advantage of, to go and see inside the building. Apparently there's vestiges of the old restaurant.
Oh,
and a large area was on the second floor. And it got me thinking, boy, as the Ninth Avenue L roared by in 1878, it would have passed right, right in front of that large room where presumably they holded banquets and stuff like that.
yeah.
So,
Well, it might not have. It probably wouldn't have been built immediately after the opening of the L. It took a while before
yeah.
these buildings sprang up, but it's true that it would have had the L running right in front of it, and the L was not electrified until 1902, so you could have had smoke, coming right in the room.
And speaking of the L, and again, we're all over the lot here, but some of the workers that put the Croton Aqueduct underground supposedly took some of the blocks of stone that you showed in that one engraving and used them to build Ascension Church. But I think that's substantially wrong.
I had read someplace that some of those blocks of stone from the aqueduct,
right,
went to
St. Paul's.
went to the one at
St. Paul the Apostle down at 60th.
St. Paul the Apostle. Yeah.
Yep. So we should check that out. I don't know how we do that. Well, you, me, and Abby, and maybe Michael with a flashlight can do it at night. I also question on Morningside Drive, on the property of the cathedral at about between 111th and 112th Street. There's some old block stones that had to come from somewhere. And either they came from the Leek and Watts orphanage, which was on that site, or they might have come from the Croton Aqueduct, which, as you pointed out in that image, was above ground before they buried it. Anyhow, I throw that out there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a question from Eric, if this Lion Brewery has any connection to the Lion's Head Pub at 109th and Amsterdam, if we know about any potential influence.
I suspect not. I think Gil, chime in on this. I think they just took the name because
Yeah,
a
yeah,
little bit of history in the area.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are probably there are probably a few hundred pubs named the Lion's Head in merry old England.
Yeah.
And the
Well,
Lions
and
opened
some of
up-
us went on eBay and I think we got some Lion Brewery beer bottles.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
neat. We have another question from Ken about another Columbia College hangout called the College Tavern at about 3041 Broadway, so a little bit north of campus around the 1900s.
You know, the name rings a bell, the College Tavern. Do you know what was what the cross street was there, Ken?
It's where the Union Theological Seminary.
Yeah. It's like 121st or so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, I don't know. I've heard the name. We should look into that. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Got it. And we'll take one last question before we wrap up for the night.
Do we have another question dangling there?
Let me see. I don't think so. I think that might have been it.
All right.
All right.
Well,
Thank you so much,
thanks for sticking with us through all the digressions.
Yeah.
Yes, and again, the recording will be available tomorrow morning at the website. And make sure to follow us for our upcoming events. We have our next presentation on October 9th. We have the Fireman's Memorial with Stephanie Azzarone.
Uh-huh. Right. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.